Good evening and welcome to the show. This is the First Amendment, historically speaking, and my name is Frederick Douglass Dixon, and I will be your host. As always, I would like to thank UPTV and all of their laborers for allowing us to come before you weekly and give what we consider to be esoteric information that we hope will enlighten the home, enlighten the community, and enlighten the society. I have to give a special thanks to Daniel. He's so very helpful, and I appreciate his assistance. I would like to go directly into our subject today. Our subject today is a historical subject. Recently, we have had to stop on our historical timeline to deal with those things that have been in the media and those things that have rocked our society. So in a effort to get back to what the First Amendment truly means, historically speaking, I would like to talk about one historic event. And this historic event is of great magnitude in the landscape of history, but it seems to have been written out of history. And for those of us who are not familiar with the Houston Mutiny of 1917, we hope today we can enlighten and give a clear version of what took place with the Houston Mutiny of 1917. Now, the Houston Mutiny of 1917 is considered to be, and it is actually, the largest murder trial in American history. It involves 63 soldiers, and the actual proceedings we will go forth with, but we want to get that straight directly from the beginning, that this is the largest murder trial in American history. It also is the only trial in American history where someone was sentenced, found guilty, convicted, and sentenced to death without an automatic appeal. So now the legalities of the Houston Mutiny, we will do our best to uncover, and the social atmosphere that created the Houston Mutiny is where we'll begin. So in 1917, we think of Texas, Houston, and Harris County. Over 150,000 people lived in that area at that time. And within that population, there was what they call the largest population of blacks in the South. So Houston claimed to have the largest group of black citizens in the South, along with a huge population of other immigrants and American citizens. So it's a virtual melting pot, if you will. And 1917 in itself ties directly to the stronghold of two Southern portions of etiquette that we'll discuss. One is Jim Crow laws and the legal and systematic segregation of blacks and whites, as well as World War I, which 1917, these two things fall right into place. So when we look at those two dynamics, we find that Houston in itself is a very unique city at this particular time, and is as well a place that has become a hotbed of social structure, and what we know now has set the pace for how Houston looks today. So this is one of those instances that we find not a lot of information on, and especially for those of us who aren't archivists. You won't hear a lot about the Houston Mutiny of 1917. So today we'll do our best to give you just some background, and then we'll go through the actual mutiny itself and along to the trial and the outcomes. So in 1917, Houston is a city that is in itself looked to as a place where the United States government was willing to forward money to develop a lot of stations and a lot of camps to train soldiers for war or battle in World War I. So one particular place that has become very famous, and this ties right into our subject, Camp Logan. It was a experiment, but what it was a place that would house a huge amount of soldiers that would be preparing to go to battle in World War I. Now, we talked about Jim Crow. Jim Crow in itself had been what we know as social etiquette, Southern social etiquette. Now, another social dynamic that we must tie into it is that in 1917, we're reaching the end of what they call the nadir of lynching. So the South, a huge city, soldiers, Jim Crow, as well as the nadir or the worst point of lynching. All of these have to go together for us to get a clear understanding of Camp Logan, Houston, Texas. So when we think about what Jim Crow had done and what it historically used as pillars to create the atmosphere, then segregation is the first place that we should start. These particular groups, although they lived in the same city, they were completely different entities. These were like a city within a city. Now, Houston itself was known at this particular time for a huge amount of political fraud. So this particular summer, the governor of the state of Texas is on trial for fraud, as well as there were some questions about the mayor, and the mayor, the longtime mayor, was replaced by a new mayor who wasn't as popular. So as I go through this, I would like for you all to see some of the things that are still happening today politically, some of the things that are still happening as we look to the new president to be elected, and how politics hasn't changed much, only the players have changed. So Houston in itself is a city amongst cities, as we mentioned, but there are some places in Houston that have a connection to both black and white Houstonians. And that one place, well, one of the places is the red light district. The red light districts in themselves were dens of iniquity, and that vice and the morality that was questioned was a huge, it posed a huge ability to create revenue. Now, Houston in itself, as being a place where the United States government was looking to house camps, begins to be seen as a place of an advancement, as a place where the United States can forward contracts, and those local people in Houston can begin to benefit from the contract. So Camp Logan is being built. Camp Logan in itself is a huge camp, and what challenged Jim Crow during this particular time was an experiment. And this experiment by the United States government was to train both black and white soldiers in the same camp in large southern cities. So Houston is a place right now that is looking to create revenue legally and illegally, and it is doing that job well, and then the government comes in. And the government says that they're going to provide jobs, they're going to provide funding for Houston to become a place where the military will train soldiers. So the combustible parts of Jim Crow are in the forefront of us understanding Camp Logan and its mutiny. So when we look directly to what were the causes of this particular mutiny, we have to look to what Jim Crow had set up as far as a segregated society. This was being challenged. So now the Houstonians, the white Houstonians from the very beginning expressed, at best, questions about housing and training soldiers in the exact same camp. Historically, black soldiers were trained in places that were more so out of the city, the outskirts, if you will, of wherever they were trained and out of the way. So to have this change or sweeping paradigm shift was indeed groundbreaking. So Houston traded off what had been historically Jim Crow etiquette for the influx of government cash and government funding, which would give the city a boost in revenue and also give them a sense of self-efficacy that would be on the rise and looked to as a city where you could live and where you could move to because of the prospects of jobs. So now a lot of the politicians were in on these particular decisions. Again, we talked about the mayor being a newly appointed mayor, and the governor himself, Ferguson, Mr. Ferguson himself, was on trial for fraud and bribery. These particular issues remind me of my hometown, Chicago. So well into this particular investigation, we find the same things that have been corrupt contemporarily have been historically the same measures of what we call bribery, fraud, and the idea of a politician being crooked. A wise man once said, 9 times out of 10, if you see a politician's mouth moving, it's a lie. We want to be very clear, especially about Houston at this particular time. But let's go and make sure that we have it correct. The idea of Jim Crow, the idea of lynching being very popular as a social control, as well as the influx of revenue play a large part. So when we look to Houston, and a couple of occurrences have to be cleared up. But before we do, there was literally, during the month of June in 1917 and the month of August, an influx of over 600 black soldiers into a camp that was, although it was segregated, they were still on the same grounds. But the training amongst these groups was indeed desegregated, if you will. So this challenges Jim Crow. This erases what one of the stalwarts of Jim Crow has meant for years. So anytime you see a sweeping paradigm shift, you always have pushback, and you also have folks who just will not agree with the change. Well, we know change can sometimes be tough. And as well, Houston understood that there was a bigger picture that they wanted to trade off for one summer, maybe 2 summers, maybe sometime a year or 2 of having this experiment, and they wanted to see if it went well. Well, from the very beginning, the Houston society, the citizens disagreed. They wanted to remain with Jim Crow paradigms. Understood. We understand that the red light districts crossed those lines. Understood. We also understand that during this particular time, Texas is one of the leading states for lynching black men. So Houston at this time is combustible. There are a lot of dynamics that play into this. So one more dynamic is the idea of the Houston Police Department under investigation in itself for corruption. Now it's really starting to sound like Chicago. So the governor, the mayor, the police chief definitely sounds familiar to me. So it begins by a huge problem in that society, and that is police brutality towards blacks. Now the black section of Houston is known as San Felipe. That's right now the 4th Ward. And if you know the 4th Ward, the 5th Ward, and the 6th Wards, very impoverished areas. Some of the highest crime districts probably in the entire country. So if we go back historically, this place has held or housed a black population since the separation and the physical segregation of Jim Crow. So now it begins to become a little more clearer to those of us who are not familiar that these things have been over 100 years in the making. So the police brutality in Houston, in the San Felipe district, was known ubiquitously, and some of the police officers had been there for years. Some of those police officers, 2 in particular we'll discuss, Officer Sparks and Officer Daniels. Both of these 2 men were reared in the trainings of their parents and grandparents who were very serious and played a large part in the Confederacy during the Civil War. So we looked at some of these men, especially these 2 men, Sparks and Daniels, as being scions of the Confederacy. When we look directly at one particular instance, we'll talk about more than one, but one particular instance is Officer Sparks who was known to be a bully. He was also known to be one who never forgot or gave way to an instance to reinforce Jim Crow laws, even to the point where his above and beyond behavior was duly noted by his superior officers. But nothing was considerably done about his behavior. Daniels was known as Daniel Boone because of his physical prowess. And he had a reputation of also being very heavy-handed on police brutality when it came to blacks. And more specifically, these two were known for being brutal towards black women in public. Now, that being the case, and the influx of 600 soldiers who not all were a part or raised or reared in Jim Crow society, under Jim Crow laws, caused some friction. And the friction mounted as we find that Sparks, Daniels, and a few of their other comrades had multiple cases brought against them about their brutality. So one particular instance where Mr. Sparks, Officer Sparks and Officer Daniels were chasing what they call crap shooters. One was called Okra and the other was called Canned Goods. These were their nicknames at that time. And these two young men were said to be notorious crap shooters. But if we talk about crime and we talk about the simplicity of crime or those that are misdemeanor crimes and felony crimes, the idea of crap shooting was indeed a misdemeanor crime. So Officer Sparks gave chase to Okra and Canned Goods, and he could catch neither. So as they disappeared, he gave chase into a young mother's home who was a mother of 5 children. Her name was Mrs. Travers. Mrs. Travers, who was in her home with her children at the time, actually here comes Officer Sparks, who literally runs into her home. And as she asked and figured out that there is a problem, she asked Officer Sparks what the problem was, and he said that she was hiding or she saw these alleged crap shooters. So he literally runs through her house, he goes in the backyard, and he fires off his weapon. At this point, Mrs. Travers, who was, as they say, built in a very sturdy fashion, she becomes very defensive about this particular incident. So Officer Daniels, who has yet to come into the household, so that leaves Sparks and that leaves Mrs. Travers. And the argument ensues and it elevates and to the point where, as she said, and we quote her, Mrs. Travers said, she said that he literally hauled off and smacked her in her own home. Because as it's seen by Officer Sparks, his idea was that Jim Crow now, Jim Crow forever, and there are specific positions that both of these individuals played in that scenario. So again, Officer Sparks, inside someone's home, he literally abuses this particular woman. And not only that, handcuffs her and drags her out to the street where she is kicking and fighting, and he smacks her again. So now the neighborhood is beginning to see. And Officer Daniels, Daniel Boone, big, strong, broad-shouldered young man, begins to, as well, attempt to get Mrs. Travers in some sort of order because she's kicking and she's fighting and she's screaming. And it's becoming very visible to those on her block. So as this particular scenario moves along, there were 2 young men who were both soldiers from the 24th Infantry. Now I have to stop right there. The 24th Infantry has a unique history known as the Buffalo Soldiers, who have fought valiantly in the Civil War, in the Panama conflict, as well as with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders that they said the 24th Infantry and the Buffalo Soldiers saved the day, affectionately known as the 24th. That was the infantry that became part of this particular mutiny. So there was a sergeant, Sgt Baltimore, who was a part of the 24th, who was downtown in the San Felipe district on a pass when another young soldier came to him and told him what happened. As he goes to investigate, he runs into Sparks and asks Sparks a series of questions. Sparks, with his background and his being agitated by Mrs. Travers, becomes even more so agitated. And because of Baltimore's questions, they become tangled in a physical confrontation where Sparks removes his revolver and he hits Mr. Baltimore, Private Baltimore, over his head a series of times. So as Baltimore runs away from the conflict, he runs into the neighborhood and he runs into an abandoned house. He's chased by Sparks and Daniels, and they say that more than 3 shots were let off. Now later, Sparks admitted that he shot his gun, but he said he was just attempting to scare him. So Baltimore, after this particular incident, the soldiers who were downtown on their pass are now given firsthand information about what's going on. So Mr. Baltimore and Mrs. Travers are taken to the police station. Mrs. Travers is never charged with any crime. Mr. Baltimore is locked up for intervening in police affairs. Now, he is bleeding, but as the word gets back to Camp Logan and the 24th Infantry, they say that Mr. Baltimore was not only hurt in this scuffle, but killed. So inaccurate information is circulating around Camp Logan. So now, as this information begins to multiply and fester, we find that the 24th Infantry is beginning to become perturbed. Now, there's this long-standing feud that has been going on in this area between the police and private citizens. Now, the influx of 600 trained officers only raises the stakes. Now, some of these officers had already fought in World War I. Some of these officers were looking to be a part of society because they fought in European countries for American freedom. So they had a different mindset about how America would look when they returned from fighting, or how America should be and how Jim Crow should not be a part of it. So we continue, and we find that as they return to Camp Logan, all of the 24th Infantry is beginning to gather, and in a very calm manner, they begin to organize. And when they organized, they chose a leader. Well, he chose himself. His name was Vita Henry. And when Mr. Vita Henry took over, they immediately made plans for retaliation. Now, when Mr. Baltimore shows back up on the camp, some of those officers on the camp think that's just enough to calm down this particular situation. So for the most part, most of the black soldiers were satisfied. But then there was a group that was not. And they were hell-bent on retaliation of the police. Now, a couple of places allowed for public displays of collective resistance. One was the streetcar. The other were bars and things of that nature. So as this 24th Infantry begins to organize, they raid the ammunition tent, they pull their rifles, and they organize, and off they go to the San Felipe district, looking for Sparks and Daniels, not knowing what Sparks nor Daniels look like. So they are on their way on the hunt. The first group of people that they run into are not even 1,000 feet outside of the camp where shooting takes place. So now, a group of civilians who run into the 24th Infantry understand that there might be trouble because now you have black soldiers armed and walking in a manner that seems very antagonistic, and now their collective resistance is beginning to show. And because we don't have the proper time to continue this in depth, I want to get to what happened. Over 20 casualties of white Houstonians, police, streetcar vendors, streetcar patrolmen. These particular people were targeted during the Houston Mutiny. Now, what came of the Houston Mutiny? This is, again, the largest murder trial in American history. 5 of the soldiers were hanged by January of 1918. It reached to the pinnacle of American politics, and the White House and Woodrow Wilson, in his thought to intervene, gives 5 of the soldiers who were sentenced to death, he commutes their sentence to life. 54 of the soldiers are sentenced to life in prison. Only 3 were acquitted. This is indeed America in 1917. And how does it look the same today? We understand that historically, when we don't know the fortitude of our own, when we don't know the history accurately and correctly, we can't look at the present in an intelligent manner. So a wise man once said, those who do not master their history are bound and doomed to repeat it. This particular instance, this particular historical event is something that is well worthy of us teaching our children. Well, just by being the largest murder trial in American history and the only murder trial in American history without an automatic appeal for those who are convicted of capital punishment, then indeed we need to pay attention. I know to some of you all, it doesn't really make sense. It's going to give you a lot of answers about what you will face in the near future. Camp Logan, Houston, Texas, 1917, well worthy of your ability to research in a fashion that's humorless. Now, I want everyone to understand that we will continue to forward to you some of these historical events that you can go back and check yourself. And maybe you become a bit more attuned to American history and that which we will see as the future continues. Ladies and gentlemen, this information may in no means change your mind, but because truth and you are so very important to me, I just thought you ought to know. I remain, with esteem and respect, a distinguished man of color, Frederick Douglass Dixon. Thank you.